Thank you for coming. My name is Orville Schell, and I run the Center in U.S. China Relations here at the Asia Society. This is a somewhat unusual event, I have to say, because this book, Korean Messiah by Kim Il-sung, does combine two elements which we're not usually accustomed to having in tandem, both Christianity and Leninism. And in this regard, I think Kim Il-sung is a very interesting man and does suggest that, belief systems, however they are constructed, whether they're religious, political, or Jim Jones, or whatever, do share a lot in common, and they're easily sort of traded one for another. And in fact, there was a very interesting book written by a psychoanalyst, Robert J. Lifton, about thought reform in China, and how when missionaries underwent thought reform, they held out the longest against communism. But when they went big time. So it makes me think that kind of Kim Il-sung is kind of an avatar of both of those syndromes. So we are joined tonight by Julian Gewirtz, who is the Senior Director for China and Taiwan Affairs at the NSC under the previous administration, and Deputy China Coordinator at the State Department, and has had a long and distinguished career in Asian and Chinese affairs. And Jonathan, whose book, I have to say, I counted them. There are 48 pages of footnotes. I don't think I've ever seen a book with more footnotes than your book, and that alone, I'm sure, drove your publisher to distraction to have to pay for all those extra pages of, but congratulations on that fun fact. And Jonathan has been the bureau chief both in Korea for the Wall Street Journal and in China, and you've been there how many years?
7 years in Beijing.
7 years. So that's quite a run, and we might actually talk about what's happening to the media in China a little bit at some point, if you guys are of a mind to do it. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Orville. And as Orville said, I'm Julian Gewirtz, and I'm also very proud to be affiliated with his center here, and delighted to be able to celebrate the publication day, no less, of Korean Messiah, which I was lucky enough to get a pre-publication copy of, and my first reaction was to go to the gym to bulk up a little more, but my second reaction was to devour it, and I'm so glad to have gotten to read it because it is just an extraordinary work of history, of scholarship, and also of writing, and the craft of turning these stories from the past into what feel fresh and contemporary and relevant. So kudos to you. It really is a history of Korea, in addition to a profound and original argument about the Kim dynasty and the origins of the cult of personality. So I think maybe just to get us started, Jonathan, if you can tell us a little bit about how you came to this project, how you ended up writing this work. And I should just say for the audience, we're going to talk about Korea, about Kim Il-sung for a while, and then we are going to use the opportunity of having the China bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal here to also talk a bit about China. But Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks, Orville, and to the Asia Society. It's really a pleasure to be here. It is my book publication date. It's also, as some people have noted, perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not, that it's Kim Il-sung's birthday right now in North Korea. It's the Day of the Sun, the holiest day on the North Korean calendar, the day that he was born in 1912, which incidentally, does anybody know what happened? What else happened on the day that he was born, April the 15th, 1912?
Well, I know because I read the book, but from the audience.
Does anyone know what happened on April the 15th, 1912? No.
Something with Japan?
No? A major world event took place. The sinking of the Titanic, yes, on the very... That's right. On the day that the Titanic sank, you know, the West is falling and the East is rising, I guess you could say, to sort of sum up everything we're going to talk about today. Okay, yeah, but I'll just quickly talk a little bit about how this book came to be. I was sent to Korea for the Wall Street Journal. I was based here actually for 3 years. Thanks to Ken Brown here, he was. Man in Pink here was an editor at the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and brought me from Hong Kong, where I started my career with the Journal, to New York. I was here for 3 years. I studied Korean at the Korea Society nearby, and when they sent me off to Seoul in 2013, I read as much as I possibly could about Korea, and I was just always very. I just found it so puzzling that Pyongyang, before it was known for what it is today as the capital of the Kim dynasty, was known as the Jerusalem of the East. It was the most Christianized city in all of Asia. It was home to some of the largest churches in the world. It was home to the world's largest Presbyterian seminary. Billy Graham's wife went to high school in Pyongyang in the 1930s because it was where all the missionaries sent their children to go to school, and she was the daughter of missionaries to Jiangsu province in China. So I thought this was an interesting starting point. I also went up to Pyongyang for the first time in 2013. I went again in 2017 at the invitation. The second time was at the invitation of the North Korean government. They invited us at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the New Yorker for 3 separate trips during Trump's first term to kind of send the message, I think, to America that we're not afraid of you and your sanctions aren't working. But when I went in 2013, I was just really struck by what I would describe as the religiosity of the country. You go there, the first place they'll take you, and Billy Graham, I have this in the book as well, he visits North Korea in 1992, and when he's taken to, first to Kim Il-sung's birthplace, where it's a humble thatched hut cottage, and all this other stuff, and he jokes, and he says, all they're missing are the 3 wise men in the manger. This looks very familiar to me. And they took me to the foot of the 66-foot statue of Kim Il-sung in the center of Pyongyang, where we're all to bow. Every person you'll see on the street wears a badge pin with Kim Il-sung's face on it. You're literally singing his praises. You're dusting his portrait in your home every morning. You're opening the newspaper, and there he is on the front. You're turning on the TV, and there he is on the news. And to me, it was just it struck me as very religious in a certain way. And so I thought, well, is there any connection between the Jerusalem of the East from about a century ago and the religiosity of North Korea today, this extraordinary cult of personality? And so it didn't take me very long to recognize that the pivot point here is Kim Il-sung himself, the founder of the North Korean state, comes to power at the age of just 33, quite young you compare him to Stalin and to Mao. They both came to power in their early 50s. He was 33 when he took power in Pyongyang, and he lived quite a long life. He lived for 49 years. So for half a century, Kim Il-sung was the ruler of North Korea, and he was born in this Jerusalem of the East. He was raised in its churches. His grandparents and his parents were among the very first converts to Christianity. And so when he grew up in Pyongyang, he grew up going to church every Sunday, but not just going to church every Sunday. He taught Sunday school. He learned to play organ in the church. He performed in church plays. He spoke at the YMCA. He lived in the home of a pastor for 2 years as a teenager. He was steeped in Christianity. He was a quintessential product of this Jerusalem of the East. And so when he comes back to power comes back home in 1945 at the age of 33. I don't think it's a coincidence that the state he then constructed had these religious resonances. And that's sort of the working thesis I had. And I then went on a bit of an academic excursion into the archives of the missionaries, but also the North Korean, everything that they produced. And that's how you get to 768 pages.
Fabulous. And, one thing that is an irony embedded in this project is he is, on the one hand, clearly adapting from the Christian experiences and exposure that he had, and on the other hand, he's cracking down on the worship of Christianity, on churches, and very much wants to remove that allegiance to something else, because, as you argue so forcefully, the core belief system of Kim Il-sungism is absolute loyalty, fealty to the leader. So talk a little bit about how he navigates, in your mind, adapting these influences in North Korea while eradicating the influence of the church.
Yeah, I don't have any. I mean, I wish he was more forthcoming or more honest in his writings. So I can't.
He didn't sit for an interview for the book.
No,
as
he
I
did not
recall.
sit. No, he didn't sit. And the interiority and the motivations of a self-mythologizing dictator who died in 1994, who I never met and had a chance to interview. I'm not going to try to go there, and I try to be very modest in some ways. You say forceful in my arguments. I hope that I was modest as well, because I know what I don't know, and what we don't know, and what is inaccessible to any of us until the North Korean archives are ever open, if they're ever open, and if they're honest, is that we simply don't know what was driving a lot of these decisions. We can infer, and that's what we've tried to do. And what I infer is that growing up in the Jerusalem of the East, sitting on his mother's lap in a packed church, the missionaries would talk about how the churches were so full, they really worried that the walls would bulge out. This is how full these churches were. And I think he understood intuitively, because he was raised in this, the power of religion, the power of faith. I think he really intuitively understood that. So when he comes to power at the age of 33, I think he treats Christianity, and again, this is my inference here, as both inspiration, but as a potential rival faith to what he ends up constructing. And so that requires this delicate two-step. He's both learning and adapting and adopting, but he's also shutting out Christianity. And so his relationship with Christianity is so interesting. At the end of his life, he ends up building churches in North Korea. He ends up inviting all sorts of pastors, of course, including Billy Graham, to North Korea. He ends up praying with some of them. He ends up singing church songs from his childhood in his old age. And yet, that doesn't change the fundamental fact that he was perhaps the greatest persecutor of Christianity in the 20th century. He's certainly up there at the top of the list.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating irony, and it gets into one of the reasons I found the book so eye-opening, because we all know that dictators adapt. They're totally sui generis in some sense, and then actually you realize once you begin to scratch the surface that they're adapting constantly. One other thing I wanted to ask you about is, when we think about religion, we generally think of voluntary belief. Of course, religions are imposed politically and there's coercion involved, but say a little bit about how you see the balance of coercion and genuine belief in some of the episodes that you chronicle, because this seems like another area where the North Korean case is quite distinctive, quite different from aspects of the Chinese case or the Soviet case, but also others outside of Asia.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's no question that repression is a big part of the mix here in North Korea. That's always been the case, and I think it continues to be the case under the third-generation ruler. But I think what is the genius of what Kim Il-sung and his successors presided over is that there was a lot of almost voluntary sort of acceptance of this. Now, you got to put a very big asterisk on the word voluntary, because he created an environment, a Truman Show, as it were, where, think about it, it's now been 80 plus years that this family has been in charge. There has not been any reform and opening. There's never been any glasnost or perestroika. This has been one narrative, and it's only gotten more and more and more extreme. I mean, it's always been the Hermit Kingdom, and Hermit Kingdom overstates it a little bit, both for historical Joseon Dynasty Korea, but also for North Korea today. But in the main, it's generally pretty true. This is an isolated country, and it's in many ways self-isolated. And so they were able to craft this. And so if you create a world in which you get to create a reality, how voluntary is any of this belief? That's a very philosophical question, but certainly it's voluntary in the sense that I think many people in North Korea, when you see images of North Koreans weeping during the funeral of Kim Il-sung, and it's quite dramatic and quite over the top. I encourage you to go on YouTube and look at footage of it. It's mass hysteria to a certain degree, and there are questions about how real that was, but I actually think it was to a large degree real. It's, of course, within the parameters of this alternate reality that they've created, but I think those emotions are very real. And one little fun fact I always love to just finish this thought off with is that, done the math on this, 25 million people in North Korea, even if you give a 20% haircut and you say 20% don't actually believe, they're just going through the motions, you still get to about 20 million people. And if you treat Kim Il-sung-ism as a religion, as I would contend it is, that really does put it on the scale of world religions. 20 million, that's more than the number of practicing Jews around the world right now. I mean, that's the scale of this. Even if you apply a 20% discount, and yes, you'll have to allow that all 20 million of these people are in one geographically confined place, but it's a world religion if you want to look at it that way, and one of quite some scale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as I was reading the book, I found myself grappling with this question of coercion and violence and belief, and those are not necessarily something that we can distinguish, but, you know, when you have cases of people who are executed for not applauding sufficiently intensely, which you also allude to, you know, you wonder, even if perhaps individuals, we don't know, but can't totally tell the difference between, you know, that the violence is pervasive, and it's just an interesting other dimension to this that comes out of the book. One moment in the book that I just thought was so interesting, and that to me reflects my bias as an American, but that really stood out to me, is the trip that Jimmy Carter takes, which you narrate right toward the end of the book. And so, I mean, it would be great if you could tell people about that, but in particular, you mentioned a moment ago this late in life blooming of a certain degree of re-engagement with Christianity from Kim. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you're asking about that. Re-engagement is I think the right word. I don't want to say he re-embraces the church, because there's two problems with that word. One is that it presupposes that he had embraced the church as a young man. He certainly went to church and participated in church, but whether or not he was really a Christian or not, well, that's a more complex question, and I'll leave that to others to figure out. But embracing too is I'm not sure the right word either, because there is significant doubt about how real that was, how tactical it was. But I genuinely think it was more than tactical. I think it was nostalgia that drove him to a degree, and I think a lot of people, you know, when they're on their deathbed or close to their deathbed, are going to be wrestling with these questions of life after death and these sort of transcendental sort of questions. I think that's pretty natural. But towards the end of his life, Kim Il-sung, after persecuting the church for decades, has this, as Julian just said, this re-engagement with the faith. He starts to invite pastors to come visit him in Pyongyang. He prays with some of them, or allows some of them to say grace. He impresses them with his knowledge of the book of Leviticus and so on and so forth. He's wow, who knew he knew the Bible this well? He invites one of his childhood church youth group friends to come back, and he talks about there's just tears flowing down their faces. They're singing songs from their youth group together. He still keeps an organ in his in Pyongyang, because he learned to play the organ in church. All this, and one of my favorite anecdotes, and this is from, by the way, from North Korean sources. This is not from some defector or some dissident. This is from the official North Korean press here. He has an encounter with an interlocutor who comes visits him, and he tells this man, my mother came to me in a dream. What should I do? Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us the content of that dream, but I can tell you my surmising. His mother was a very devout Christian. She was a Bible woman in the language of the times, which meant that the Presbyterian Church had basically empowered her to go from village to village, educating women, teaching them how to read by reading the Bible. That's what she did. And she herself was a daughter of a church elder, very devout. And so his mother appears to him, and I sort of imagine that the mother must have made him feel some sort of weight, some sort of guilt, some sort of shame. I don't know. Here's where I'm stretching a little bit, but Kim Il-sung asks his interlocutor, what should I do? And the answer comes back, you should build a church for your mother on her birthplace. And so that's what he does. And he builds a church for his mother on the outskirts of Pyongyang. It's actually the second church that he builds. He builds one in 1988, and the second one in 92 he builds. And I had the privilege of being able to visit both of them, because when I went in 2017 for the Wall Street Journal, it was at the height of Fire and Fury and all the rest of it, as I mentioned earlier. And at that opening banquet that they threw for us, they asked the four of us who came from the Wall Street Journal, what would you like to see while you're here? And so our answer, of course, was we'd like an interview with Kim Jong-un, which didn't happen. We said we'd like to go visit your nuclear facilities, which didn't happen. But it just happened that our trip straddled a weekend. It went from Thursday to Tuesday or something like that. This was 2017. And I was already deep in the research on this book. So I said, well, can we go to church on Sunday? And so they said, yeah, sure. We can take you to church on Sunday. So me and my three colleagues, we went to church on Sunday, and we were able to go to both churches. There's only two officially recognized churches there, right? And they're both Protestant churches. They're both in Pyongyang. Unfortunately, both of their Sunday morning services are at precisely the same time, so we weren't able to attend both. But we attended service in one, and they took us to the other one, which was the one that he built for his mother. And I can talk about that if people are interested, but let me stick with the story here a little bit. That Kim Il-sung does all these things towards the end of his life, and I think re-engagement is the right word. And Jimmy Carter is part of this re-engagement. Not explicitly. Billy Graham definitely is. But Jimmy Carter, as those who recall or have read the history know, he was there to defuse a nuclear crisis, the first North Korean nuclear crisis. So he was really there as a former president of the United States. That's really why he was there. But those of us who remember and know Jimmy Carter will know, of course, that he was perhaps the most... He wore his faith on his sleeve, perhaps more than any other recent U.S. president. Perhaps George W. Bush would be the only other one who you could sort of put up in that same category. Although we do have a president now who is tweeting himself as Jesus. So yes, but Jimmy Carter, I don't think, whether or not you liked him politically or not, I don't think many people would have doubted his commitment to his Christian faith. That was very much a part of his political identity. And so he does go and meet with Kim Il-sung. I did also have the chance, I did go down to attend his Sunday school in Plains, Georgia as part of this research, and I did pose the question to him when we're all shaking hands with him and taking a photo with him, whether or not he did raise the faith with Kim Il-sung. At this point, Jimmy Carter must have been 97 or something like that. He didn't really give me much of a straight answer. It was not the ideal time to ask him, but that was the only chance I had. I find it hard to believe that he couldn't have raised that because he was very well briefed. Georgia had a very big community there of engagers with North Korea from the church, including a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Jim Laney, who was a Methodist minister. But be that as it may, he's there. He meets with Kim Il-sung, and he writes in a letter, I believe, to Bill Clinton, that's in the archives down in Atlanta, where he says, what I'm seeing in North Korea under Kim Il-sung, keep in mind, this is 1994, he says, reminds me so much of what's going down in Waco, Texas right now. It's so similar. These guys are just like the Branch Davidians. In other words, it's kind of a cult, you know? I mean, that he doesn't use that word, and I'm very careful using that C word because it's a very loaded word. It's basically a pejorative word. I don't think you can use it in a neutral sense, except perhaps in the context of saying a cult of personality. There, perhaps you can use a more neutral inflection there. But anyways, I'm rambling a little bit here. But yeah, Jimmy Carter, of course, he is at the very end of the book because Jimmy Carter meets with him two weeks before Kim Il-sung dies, and yeah, let me stop there.
It's a remarkable moment, as you say, because you have these two former Sunday school teachers who took these extraordinarily different paths and who come back together at that moment. So it's the kind of unlikely encounter that the book is full of. I want to ask you to read for the group a little excerpt from the book before we shift to talking about U.S. China. But before I do, because you raised it, how do you think about global lessons about the cult of personality and religion from this book? And in particular, as you alluded to, in a week where the President of the United States is publishing and then removing images of himself as a doctor, but images of himself that have unmistakable religious iconography depicting himself as Jesus and, healing to the touch and these sorts of things that are commonalities with the personality cult in the DPRK. How do you think about that, and how did that factor into your thinking this week as you launched this book into the world?
Well, I certainly didn't plan for the president to tweet or to post that image. I don't necessarily know what to make of his denial. Oh, that I didn't, I didn't mean it this way or that way, or so on. He certainly deleted it, so he recognized at some level that this was not a good tactical move for him. But I think I don't know. I mean, I may dodge the question a little bit just because I do want to sidestep sort of the inherent politics of it. But I think I had mentioned, of course, Jimmy Carter was he wore his faith on his sleeve. George W. Bush did as well. Donald Trump is obviously a very different person than those two, and especially with respect to religion. But I think there's one commonality here, and I try to wrestle with it a little bit in the book of how much Kim Il-sung himself constructed his own cult of personality and how much it was constructed for him, how much he permitted it to be constructed. And I think that there always is that interplay there. And I think in the case of Donald Trump, I think what we see is we have people who support him who have kind of begun to create a cult around himself. I don't think he himself is necessarily actively doing it. I mean, a lot of it are retweets of people portraying him in this sort of a way. I don't know that is necessarily gives him a free pass or anything, but certainly I think it can happen that way. So Kim Il-sung's cult starts in 1945, and it really begins with the Soviets backing him. Of course, he's just 33 years old. He was largely anonymous when he comes to power. There is this famous name, Kim Il-sung, that he adopts, which again is won't get into it. It's all in the book, of course, but it is constructed for him. But very quickly, it begins to surpass the cult of Stalin. And there's very little question that I think by the end of the 1940s, his cult has surpassed Stalin's already by many measures. And Kim Jong-il, the second generation successor, was a film buff and really did do a lot to orchestrate an increase, in this cult of personality. But to say that Kim Jong-il had created this cult for Kim Il-sung doesn't quite compute either, because he was just 7 or 8 years old by the time Kim Il-sung's cult had already surpassed Stalin's. I don't see Kim Il-sung himself at the switch here, crafting all this. I think it was constructed for him. So I think that's my best stab at answering your question. I think in many ways, people allow the adulation to come at them. And I think it does go to your head. I don't know how it couldn't to a certain degree. I mean, even in a more secular realm, you'll kind of think of pop stars or movie stars. It does get to them. They do start to believe their own legend and their own myth. They do drink the Kool-Aid, as it were. And so I don't know if that's what's going on here, but certainly cults of personality and this propensity towards almost an element of adulation bordering on worship towards other humans continues unabated, and I don't see it abating anytime soon. It's just part of our DNA, I think, that we know that these people are just like you and me. They also have trouble sleeping. They also, have digestive issues. They also, get sad sometimes. But you put people up on a pedestal, and with Kim Il-sung, it's taken to the extreme.
Great. So why don't you, if you're up for it, I encourage Jonathan to read a little bit as his first reading from the book, maybe for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we can talk U.S. China.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Should I go to the podium? You think?
As you wish, or you can do it. You can do it.
I think it might. I don't know. Okay. Let's see if I can do it here. And I chose, with Julian's input here, I did choose sort of an unconventional passage in the book, but someone had mentioned Jim Jones, and I mentioned drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit. So I thought I would get into this a little bit because I found this just a quick cameo, but some of the most interesting stuff I found in this book. I would have loved to have gone even deeper on this, but this book is already very long. Okay, it's a small section called Fellow Travelers, and it's near the end of the book here. As Kim Il-sung's cult of personality climbed to dizzying heights, the great leader struck up relationships with two men who, like Kim, intuitively understood the power of religious faith and the ways in which it could be uniquely employed to cultivate a loyal and unwavering devotion. One of the two men, Moon Sun-myung, shared much in common with Kim Il-sung. Moon, better known as the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, was born 8 years after the great leader in a thatched roof home in northwestern Korea and raised in a devout Presbyterian home. before making his public debut in Pyongyang shortly after the Japanese surrender in 1945. Years later, Reverend Moon, looking back on those turbulent days, described Korea as hungry for a messiah. Quote, "The depth of Christian faith in Korea was extraordinary at that time. Also, there were many spiritual groups who received prophecies about the coming of a new spiritual movement. Reverend Moon was happy to oblige and in time would, like Kim Il-sung, command absolute fealty from his followers, who believed him to be the Messiah and were, in the words of one disciple, ready to face martyrdom gloriously. Reverend Moon's belief that Korea was a chosen land and the Koreans a divinely appointed people also meshed with Kim Il-sung's own brand of Korean exceptionalism." I realize that at this pace, it may take longer than 4 to 5 minutes. Is that okay, or should I skip around a little bit?
Why don't you read it? No, I'm kidding. You should skip a little bit. Read
Okay.
what you want, Jonathan. We're enjoying it. So
Okay.
if you wanna skip a few bits, go for it. But no legal obligation to do so.
Let's go to the Reverend Jones. I think he's perhaps the more interesting one. Yeah, they're both so interesting. During this period, Kim Il-sung struck up another unlikely rapport, this time with another man hailing from a very different background than his own. Jim Jones was born in Samuel Moffat's home state of Indiana. Samuel Moffat was the missionary who first brought Christianity to Pyongyang. Nearly 2 decades after the great leader's birth. Unlike Kim, Jones was not raised in the church, though after finding himself spellbound by a local preacher, he knew he had found his life's calling. Reverend Jones, modeling his ministry on a mystical Philadelphia preacher called Father Divine, began drawing followers around him in San Francisco, promoting what he called divine socialism and demanding more and more loyalty from his growing flock. In his teachings, Reverend Jones blended Christian scripture with elements of Marxism, layered over with his own paranoias, which he encouraged among his disciples by staging attacks on himself and by hosting blistering public denunciations under the guise of family meetings. Like Father Divine, Reverend Moon Sun-myung, and Kim Il-sung, Reverend Jones had his disciples call him Father, and made it increasingly difficult to leave or to question his authority, warning defectors of a death sentence. As Reverend Jones's cult of personality intensified, he moved nearly 1,000 followers to a remote settlement in Guyana that would come to be known as Jonestown. There, Jones used hard labor and sleep and food deprivation to create an atmosphere of anxiety, hysteria, and depression, in the words of the few defectors who made it out. He encouraged followers to inform on others and created a surveillance force to keep tabs on possible dissidents. Jones steadily replaced Christ with his own personality cult, for instance, having his followers sing praise songs to him on December the 25th, newly rechristened Revolution Day. Jones imposed an information blockade on Jonestown, censoring and then banning postal communications with the U.S. while presenting to his devotees a steady stream of grim headlines from America: murder, racism, and the like. Across Jonestown, omnipresent loudspeakers broadcast Reverend Jones's teachings and warnings, which were played virtually around the clock in an incessant drone. Jones shared more than a common playbook with the North Korean leader. The Indiana-born preacher and the son of Korean Presbyterians also became mutual admirers of sorts. Reverend Jones had adopted 3 children of Korean heritage, all refugees of the Korean War, a conflict that he commended as a war of liberation by the socialist North. When North Korea, which Reverend Jones looked to as a model for his own religious society, tried to reach out to Jonestown leadership in early 1978, Jones was flattered. Leaders of his People's Temple of the Disciples of Christ met more than a dozen times with Kim Il-sung's envoys, exchanging propaganda and tactics. After one meeting, Jonestown leaders declared themselves impressed by the, quote, reverent religious feeling that the North Koreans evidently had for Kim Il-sung. During mandatory meetings at Jonestown, Reverend Jones read aloud from North Korean publications extolling the great leader, screened propaganda films from Pyongyang for his followers, and even invited North Korean agents to preach the virtues of Kim Il-sungism. They exalt their leader as a savior, as a god, Kim Il-sung, Reverend Jones told his followers in one August 1978 address. He uses that power not to corrupt, but to give power to the people. With Jones fearing U.S. authorities closing in on him, he inquired with North Korean diplomats about relocating his flock to Kim Il-sung's socialist paradise. North Korea flowers in democracy with free health, free medical care, that is, free meals, collectivism, Reverend Jones said in an October 1978 sermon. The move never happened. Weeks later, on November the 18th, 1978, with scrutiny of Jonestown intensifying and a visiting U.S. congressman gunned down, Reverend Jones ordered roughly 1,000 of his followers to commit revolutionary suicide. Photos of the aftermath became one of the defining images of a troubled decade, and Reverend Jones's original San Francisco temple was later auctioned off to a Korean Presbyterian church. Though North Korea insisted its ideology was atheistic, Kim Il-sung's rapport with the Reverends Moon and Jones was no accident. In their own ways, in their own milieus, each of the three men honed remarkable personality cults that combined messianic promise and psychological control to turn religious faith into an instrument of power. As with so many religious societies of this kind, their grip on their followers rested on two implicit axioms. The leader is always right, and nobody leaves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that. And it's for all of you in the audience, I hope the kind of teaser that makes you want to pick up a copy before we release you into a beautiful spring evening. But I want to spend a few minutes, we'll come to the audience for questions in a bit, but I want to spend a few minutes now having you remove your historian of the DPRK and the Korean Peninsula hat and place on your China Bureau Chief, Beijing-based reporter hat. Because we are 1 month out from President Trump's rescheduled, postponed trip to Beijing, which I believe you'll be covering, and we're eager to hear your take on that. But before we get to that, I did want to ask you a bit of a thought experiment question, which is, what do you think Xi Jinping would make of this connection? What do you think Xi Jinping, who himself has constructed a cult of personality that has some historical antecedents that he's drawing on, what do you think he would make of this if you could hypothesize? A knowingly impossible question.
If I could hypothesize, if I could get into the head of Xi Jinping, wow, well, I'd have a couple of scoops on my hands at that point. But, I think I mentioned earlier that in North Korea there was no reform and opening. There was no glasnost and perestroika. And I think if you're looking at Xi Jinping, a lot's been made of the cult of personality that's been built around him as a revival of Maoism to a degree. But I always ask this question of people when they ask me about, especially when I'm in Beijing and talking to friends, and I've talked about this book because everyone knows I've been working on this for a long time. Any comparisons between Xi Jinping's cult and the North Koreans, I don't know that you can mention them almost in the same sentence. I ask my friends in Beijing, and if anyone's been to Beijing recently, you can try to answer this question yourself. How many times a day, unless you go out of your way to look for it, do you see Xi Jinping's face in an average day in Beijing? I can tell you my answer. It's probably zero, unless you go looking for it. If you go looking for it, of course, you can find his face. Kim Il-sung, if you're in Pyongyang, hundreds in the hundreds of you can't avoid it. He's everywhere. Been to Havana, you don't see Castro's face. You can go to Cuba for a week and not know what Fidel Castro looks like. I'm not saying the image is the only thing that counts in a personality cult, but I don't know that Xi Jinping is quite there. So if I'm in Xi Jinping's head, insofar as he does want to build that up, I don't know that he does, but insofar as he does, I don't know that it's possible to put the genie back in the bottle. We had Deng Xiaoping come along and say we went a little bit too far with this cultural revolution, 70% right, 30% wrong, and of course we saw Deng Xiaoping take China on a remarkably different path, and of course the cult of Mao at its very peak. Orville, you can dispute this if you think I'm not quite getting this right, but the cult of Mao at its most extreme was really 66 to maybe 69, I think, right? And even though the Cultural Revolution arguably went on until 76, it kind of burned itself out by 69. Now, there are a lot more people in China than in North Korea, so a lot more people were affected by this cult. But I think jealousy, perhaps, is what Xi Jinping, insofar again as he wants to build up this cult of personality. I don't know that that's possible, because you have to sort of hermetically seal a society and not give it any chance to breathe for 8 decades to get to this stature. So I don't know. I mean, when you look at this, perhaps he looks at it and does think it's grotesque. I don't know, because he of course he experienced the cult of Mao personally.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question to hear your response to, in part because I was also vacillating between, would he see this as something he's envious of, or would he see this as somehow retrograde and backward, and the cult that he is building, he believes, is more suited to the 21st century, which I don't think anyone reading your book could come away thinking that this cult of personality is designed for the 21st century, per se. So, I mean, just to get your perspective on where you think, you live in Beijing, you have a perspective that has become vanishingly rare as the number of foreign reporters in China has dwindled. How do you see people thinking about, talking about the United States, President Trump, and this upcoming visit?
Well, I think like a lot of the world, China has been surprised at just the pace that President Trump has kept up in terms of upending established norms on the global stage. I mean, even just this year, of course, we've seen Maduro in Venezuela, and then the strike on the Ayatollah in Iran was just breathtaking, both in its execution but its audacity as well, right? And I think to a certain degree, and I can't speak for all of the Chinese people. I certainly can't speak for Zhongnanhai as the leadership compound is known, right? I can't speak for them, but I surmise that they must be glad that his field of vision is elsewhere. This idea that China plays the long game, I think, is perhaps too much is made of it, but I think it is true to a large degree. I think they're happy continuing to build and build and build. We just had them finish their 14th five-year plan. What did they say 5 years ago with their 14th five-year plan? They said, we are going to work on technological self-sufficiency. Well, guess what they did over the last 5 years? They really built themselves quite a fortress when it comes to technological self-sufficiency. What did they say for the 15th five-year plan? Steady as she goes. Why would you want to deviate from this? It's working well. So they set these 5-year plans, and 5-year plans, as we know, is 1 year longer than the U.S. presidential cycle. They do have the ability, and they're not going to have policy swing from one extreme to another, as we have seen over the last, let's call it, 3 administrations here, right? So you have a lot of flip-flopping. I'm not saying their system is superior by any measure, but certainly it does allow them that luxury, and they have certainly taken advantage of it, and I think they've done relatively well with that. So I think they're happy to keep doing what they're doing. They know that the clock is running out on a second term by Trump, and presuming there is no third Trump term, I think they can wait him out as long as his ire doesn't get aimed towards Beijing. So I think they're feeling pretty comfortable, and certainly I think they think that their relative standing in the world is going up because they are seen in relative terms as perhaps more benign, perhaps as more just someone that you can work with. And I think that they certainly see themselves as that better choice for all the swing state countries around the world that are looking to the U.S., looking at China, and trying to figure out how to chart this course.
And, on the fortress point, I think if we recall, of course, the reason the trip was postponed was the war on Iran. And, initially, a lot of the coverage was quite congratulatory toward China. They've been preparing, they've been stockpiling, they're resilient, they'll weather these shocks. They've built up an unprecedented fuel reserve, etc. But of course, as this has dragged on for many weeks, it's become clear that even Fortress China is not invulnerable to geopolitical disruptions. You know, we think of this as an energy crisis, but obviously petroleum-based products are used throughout industry, and so they're beginning to have some real shortages in parts of their value chain in China. So I guess one question I have is, that is definitely right on a broad level. I don't disagree, but does President Trump potentially head into this meeting in a stronger position than I, as a former Biden appointee, or others might like to think, in part because Beijing realizes that what he chooses to do vis-a-vis Iran does actually matter for core national interests in the economic domain in China? Or is that an overreading of incomplete data?
Again, I have to be modest in my claims here too, because I simply don't know. China, of course, is not the only country that's suffering unintended consequences from what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, right? I mean, I think they have company in this respect, including the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is also going to be impacted, of course. It already is in many ways. I think it does reinforce this instinct towards insulating yourself from external shock. I think it only tells them that we were on the right path, but there's more work to be done. We need to insulate ourselves all the more so. So I think, as ideological as Xi Jinping's China is, of course, pragmatism, they're so pragmatic in so many ways. People have asked me in recent years, do they like Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Do they prefer Biden or Harris or Trump? Do they want, how do they feel about Iran? How do they feel about Venezuela? I think at a certain level, I don't know that they themselves are preoccupied with such questions, because I think in many ways they will take what's coming and they will do what, in some sense, is the obvious thing to do. You maximize the positive and you try to minimize the negative. And they're ruthlessly focused on doing that. It doesn't mean that there are no downsides to what's happened, but there are surely good sides, good things about, certainly if this becomes a full-blown quagmire for the U.S. and Iran, of course there are going to be benefits to be extracted from China's point of view. There will also be downsides that they're going to need to mitigate. But I don't know that they look at it necessarily in a normative or prescriptive way. I think they say, look, this is the hand we're dealt. This is how we're going to play our cards. Again, this is me surmising here, but I get that sense as I watch how they respond.
Good. Yeah, no, I don't actually even agree with the assertion I just made, more just straw manning it to try to tease you out a bit there. I want to come to the audience for questions, but as a last question to you, your book is a story of North Korea, an aspect of it that we know well, the cult of personality, told through a very unlikely set of discoveries that you made. On the China file, what is a story that you think is underreported or underexplored that, you living in Beijing think is really salient or important, but that maybe all of us living in New York haven't yet heard about? It is an acceptable answer to say that the Wall Street Journal's coverage is comprehensive and flawless, and therefore there is no answer to the question.
The Wall Street Journal's coverage is comprehensive and flawless. There's nothing. I mean, well, genuinely, I think, the reason I wrote this book is not because I wanted to write a book. It really isn't. When I saw this, I couldn't believe that nobody had written about this. I wanted to read this book. I really did not set out to write it. And I hope that I will find a topic in China that compels me to this degree, because China, of course, is a much larger country than Korea, just in terms of its population and its size. I know that there are stories to be uncovered there. If I knew it, I wouldn't tell you, because I would then set about
a room full of writers. Very dangerous.
Room full of writers, competitors, rivals. No, but really, I mean, I do think it is tougher in China too. I mean, the constraints that we have so few foreign journalists now in a country that large with that many people. And yes, we are clustered in Beijing and Shanghai. Surprise, surprise. I think the stories that are probably missing are the ones that I want to tell more, which is to get out into the countryside. We know that America is not just Washington, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and LA or something. We learned that lesson with the 2016 election, right? I mean, I think all of us mainstream media outlets had to do a lot of soul searching. How did we fail to document the rise of Donald Trump as a political force? And I don't know that the answer is we need to open bureaus in Topeka and in, I don't know, this city or that city. I mean, certainly there was some of that, I think, reflex, and I think that's the impulse is certainly correct in some ways. But, in China, we don't have that luxury. We cannot go everywhere. I do get followed basically everywhere I go when I leave Beijing, and sometimes it's very unsubtle. But I know that there are stories to be told in the countryside and just outside of the big cities that I do want to tell. I wish we had more. I wish we had more boots on the ground. But with my 2 boots, I'll do what I can. But it's tough.
Great. Well, I'll let you and Alec compare notes on reporting on the countryside after. Okay, audience, now is your moment to ask the hardest and most interesting questions of our distinguished speaker.
Thanks, Jonathan, for the great talk and telling us all these interesting things about DPRK. My question's about China, and also kind of segueing off of what you talked about with regards to media rights. It seems like a lot of that has tightened post-COVID, obviously. There's a big exodus. Do you see more ease in getting press visas in the future? Like, what's your outlook and the current situation?
Great. We'll take a few questions. Anyone else? We have a gentleman up here.
Yeah, I think likely the next supreme leader in North Korea is a female, right? Unless there's a son hiding somewhere, if you know. So what does the regular people in North Korea think that their next leader could be a girl? And just for reference, South Korea has female leaders, Thailand has one, India has one, Pakistan has one, Taiwan has one. Mainland China, the female leadership is seriously declined. I wonder if you can compare this perspective between North Korea and China too. Thank you.
Great, please.
All right, 2 very different questions. So I guess I should just take them in order. There's no way to combine these. But yes, the press situation in China, the foreign press situation is definitely in a bad state. What do I tend to be? I tend to be a bit more of a pessimist simply because that's an easier way to operate and plan. If we're surprised and we get more visas, wonderful. I can cross that bridge when we get there. But I do worry that we are on a glide path to zero. And just to explain a bit more of the lay of the land, the Wall Street Journal, unfortunately, I lived this all in real time. I got to China in the mid 2019, so about 6 months before COVID first started spreading in Wuhan. Our editorial page, our opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, which is entirely separate from the news page where I work, published an article that had a headline on it that the Chinese government was very unhappy with. It was "The Sick Man of Asia." Won't get into why they were so upset about it. There are many reasons, but they then proceeded to expel 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, which resulted in Mike Pompeo, then the Secretary of State, capping the number of Chinese journalists that could be resident in the U.S., which then prompted the Chinese to expel all U.S. citizens working for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I'm a Canadian citizen, so I was spared. Other non-U.S. passport holders were also spared. There were a couple of exceptions. I'm happy to talk about them afterwards if anyone's interested. Again, I lived and breathed this in real time. I was demarched multiple times by the Foreign Ministry. I spent a lot of time there listening to them tell me why we had offended the Chinese people. And so ever since then, we went from about 15 foreign correspondents in Beijing and Shanghai at the Wall Street Journal to currently 2. And the New York Times went from, I don't know, roughly call it 8 or 9 to 1 for a time, 1, 2, somewhere around there. And the Washington Post is actually a degree of magnitude smaller even at full strength. They only had 2 at full strength and then have been down to 0 for a few years. Now, the three newspapers were not the entirety of the foreign press. You also have a lot of other outlets, news wires, you have broadcast journalism, and you have some new media outlets as well. And certainly America is not the only country that sends foreign journalists to China. You also have the European outlets, you have sort of, you call it the Five Eyes countries, and many others, and the Japanese, and the South Koreans, and the Indians, and so on and so forth. So there is a broad and diverse foreign press corps, but certainly the American outlets are the best resourced and therefore the best positioned to do reporting that is more than simply reactive and reflexive. So we are the ones who are more likely to send reporters deep into the countryside and to invest that time to tell these sorts of stories and to do more investigative work. And I don't know that the Chinese are terribly unhappy that we are basically a skeleton crew. I think they don't mind that in the sense that we will cover the biggest stories, but we don't really have the boots on the ground to bring that back, to really go and get into the nooks and crannies of China. And I think that obviously is a loss for the world's understanding of China, because love us or hate us as the mainstream press, that is how most people will know about other countries. No matter how much of a jet setter, how worldly you are, you cannot be in all countries at the same time and know them well. And China is a country that deserves to be known well because it is the world's second largest economy. It is the world's second most populous nation. And it is a nation that is rapidly transforming the world with frontier technologies, certainly, but also just with even its traditional economy. Whether or not China succeeds or fails economically is of great importance to the rest of the world, right? And yet we don't have the capacity to tell those stories on the ground. And I think that is a real tragedy and a loss. And I do hope, to finally answer your question, Eva, that perhaps, and this is the optimist in me speaking, perhaps in a year where there are potentially up to 4 engagements between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, perhaps there may be some scope for a deal to restore some journalist visas. It's certainly high on my priority list. I'm not sure how high it is on the White House's priority list or on the priority list of Zhongnanhai in Beijing. But my only hope is perhaps after the first summit, the second summit, and the third summit, perhaps when they're looking for deliverables and they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, journalist visas might possibly be a part of that. But that's me daring to dream. Second question. Sorry, these are long-winded answers. Second question, I find what is more remarkable about Kim Jue, the daughter, we believe that's the name of the daughter of the name of Kim Jong-un's daughter, we still don't entirely know, is certainly the fact that she's a daughter as opposed to a son that is accompanying Kim Jong-un. I find the more remarkable thing her age, just the fact that she's so young and that she is being given so much exposure at a time. Her father is in his early 40s. Health questions aside, and I don't know what conditions he may have. Certainly has a smoking habit. But barring that, I mean, his father and his grandfather did live relatively long. I mean, there is a universe in which he is still the leader of North Korea 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, I don't know. He does have access to very good medicine, so I don't know. But so to have her accompanying her father at this age would be quite a long runway, potentially, especially when Kim Jong-il didn't have that public exposure before he came to power, and Kim Jong-un even less. And of course, at each turn, Kim Jong-il was grossly underestimated, I think we can now say in hindsight, and I think Kim Jong-un was also grossly underestimated. So I think it is remarkable on many levels. I don't know how it will play out, but I guess we'll find out. And we may not find out soon. It may be decades before we find out. So I'll leave that answer there.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I see someone here in the far right corner, if you don't mind passing the mic to her. Great, please.
Hey, congratulations for your book. Recently traveling from Beijing. So I spent a lot of time, 1 decade in the Middle East, 7 years in Iran, constantly traveling among the world of the West, China, and also the Middle East. And from what I see, because I'm on the field all the time, what I see is the people's lived realities are quite different from, say, the things we're discussing here and policy making circles and academic circles, exactly echoing what you say. I think that also comes from the lack of communication between both worlds. So my question is, do you think China and Iran, in a way, is each other's imaginative like enemies in a way? And is that what you are trying to do, demystify that and improve that communication?
Thank you. And then we'll just pass right here. And
Hi, thanks for doing this. Did reporting book on religion in North Korea as, the connecting thread, change the way that you view religion in China, or reporting on religion in China and how China approaches religion?
Great questions. The first question was really about
do you see your job as
Yeah.
bridging the lack
Yeah.
of comprehension between these peoples?
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Even to take an example that we can all relate to because we're sitting here right now, even before flying to the U.S. for the first time as a Canadian citizen, after Trump's reelection, I did wonder. I wonder whether the U.S. is going to feel different. Certainly, even at border crossings, you saw a lot of reporting about what was happening at border crossings, and I know that a lot of my peers and friends back in Beijing and in Seoul before always had these questions about what America was really like. I think of one colleague in the Seoul bureau of the Wall Street Journal who spoke perfect, flawless American English because she went to an international school in South Korea, but had never actually been to America before. She went to a trade show in Las Vegas, CES. This was more than a decade ago now. She did ask me, really, genuinely, there was no artifice whatsoever in the question, am I going to get shot in the country, right? And it's not an invalid question. We do write about mass shootings that happen in America, and certainly in Chinese state media, that's amplified. But South Korea doesn't try to egg it on or blow it up. I mean, this is an American ally, but it's a valid question. My answer, of course, was probably not. But the answer was probably. I mean, I couldn't guarantee it. And certainly, it's not wrong of the press to write about mass shootings in America. If that's not news, I don't know what is news, right? And yet, those are very, very, very real. And actually, what the Chinese state media portrays to its people about America is not incorrect in its substance. There is a lot of inequality. There is homelessness. There is gun violence. There is racism. All of these things are very real. And yet, when you get these images, you can easily think that that is all there is, right? And when we write about China, we're frequently accused of smearing China. Why do you only write the negative things about China? We do write positive things, and we don't think of stories as inherently negative or positive. We write about these stories. I think readers remember the negative stories because that's how we're wired as human beings. So yeah, we do our best. I don't know that will ever be perfect. I don't know that, and it's as much how the news is received and interpreted as it is how it's reported and portrayed. Maybe that's a cop-out, but that's kind of how I see it. And the other question, now I need a reminder. Oh, yes. The more time I spend in China, it does give me a lot of humility because I frequently have assumptions overturned. And maybe this is actually an answer to both questions here. There's so many times I sometimes think the scientific method is sort of what we apply as journalists. You start with a hypothesis, and then you go out and you test that hypothesis, and then you try to synthesize and analyze and come to a conclusion about what's going on. There have been so many times that I have had a hypothesis in my head, either because I had heard it or read it, or some sort of a narrative had developed, and so you go out there and you test your hypothesis. I don't know how many times I've had that hypothesis utterly debunked when I get there, or changed or different. And religion is actually very, very true. So I understand that I wrote this book about North Korea and religion without really being able to go there. I mentioned that I was able to go to church in Pyongyang, which is already more than what many people are able to do. But I went there for an hour on a Sunday back in 2017. I wish I had that access, but when I do have that access in China, I'm surprised again and again. I can tell stories, but I'm not going to because of time, that stepping into a Seventh-day Adventist church in Quanzhou in Fujian just a few months ago, and just being shocked at how openly they were able to worship and to proselytize, because that's sort of what happened to me while I was walking down the street. Went to a Catholic church that was definitely not part of the state-backed Catholic church with Vatican flags and other things around, that I also I thought I understood what I knew about religion in China, but I'm constantly thrown curveballs. And it's a reminder, and maybe this is the final thought to end on here, is just that I hope what I bring to this book, what I hope I bring to reporting, and I hope what most reporters bring, is a sense of humility, because we really don't know. We certainly don't know the future. So I hate to predict or to give any sort of prescriptions about what ought to be done. But I mean, describing is hard enough as it is, and it's really, really hard. And I find myself wrong-footed all the time. So you do your best, and you try to be very modest in the claims that you assert, because it's a big world. China's a big country, and there are a lot of people out there. And with one man, I get the same 24 hours anyone else does. I can't do everything, and I can't talk to everyone. And certainly not everyone wants to talk to me in China. So you do our best, basically.
Wonderful. It's a great note to end on, but I'm going to add just one final beat, which is to really exhort you all to get this amazing book. It's a fabulous read, and as you can tell from hearing Jonathan discuss, it's the product of an extremely wide-ranging and creative person. And so congratulations to you on the publication of the book, and please join me in thanking him.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Orville.